Thank you, Lakeem. So, Coleman, I invite you to comment on the function of critical race theory, at least as a conversation piece and sort of anchoring the national dialogue right now. Getting back to this question of, is this emphasis on critical race theory confusing more than it is clarifying? But also feel free to comment somewhat, at least, on your understanding and feeling about the substance of critical race theory. Do you see it as meaningfully informing the national dialogue? And do you have an instinct as to whether that is constructive or destructive?
Okay, so as a philosophy guy, I've read a lot of the original critical race theory writing by Kimberly Crenshaw and many others, and I always found it to be an intellectually interesting philosophy, um, one among many. I thought it was wrong, but I also thought it was, I think a lot of philosophies are wrong that are, worth thinking about. I definitely agree with many who have said that actually what critical race theory is, in the original academic sense of the idea, is not precisely what people are talking about when they attack or defend critical race theory, at least in the past few months in the national discourse. Um, I could go on for a long time about how I would summarize it as a philosophy, but the shortest version I can give is, well, it requires a little bit of an analogy, but let me just give this brief analogy for what I understand the philosophy of critical race theory to be. When you're a kid, you learn the concept of an accent, of someone speaking with an accent. And often kids learn this by implicitly feeling that there's a quote unquote normal way to talk, and anyone who talks different is speaking with an accent, right? Whereas you don't speak with an accent. And at some point you grow up and you realize actually any way of speaking just is an accent. You have this sort of aha moment. And what critical race theory says is it's kind of this a similar kind of realization, and except instead of being about accents, it's about the value structure of society itself. It's like there is no such thing as a neutral view from nowhere, just like there's no such thing as speaking without an accent. And the value structure of American society itself is steeped in white supremacy and racism. And so all of the standards, whether they be laws, whether they be norms, taking the SAT and the structure of standardized testing being one example. These things that may be facially neutral are in fact norms that cannot be separated from the history of white supremacy and the fact that this country is fundamentally tilted in favor of one group and against another. That's the basic insight of critical race theory. That neutral value structures certainly aren't what exist in America, and perhaps aren't even possible in principle. Now, I think that's a very interesting claim philosophically. I don't think it's right, but that's really what I understood critical race theory to be as a kind of philosophy nerd. What people are talking about when they talk about CRT today in the national discourse is not that necessarily. But they're talking about a general mood that has sort of existed since the 60s, if not earlier, um, about the narrative of what America is. Is America an inherently racist country that will never outgrow its racism? Do we need race conscious laws and policies in order to rectify the effects of slavery and Jim Crow, and a kind of muscular racial identity among Black people? Or do we need, a colorblind universalist approach to anti-racism, um, a class-based set of policies, and with an eye towards identifying as Americans before we do as members of a particular race? And I think critical race theory has become a, um, I think Christopher Rufo has had a large role in labeling that kind of mood, which has existed for many decades, with this particular philosophy, which is related to that mood. Certainly, they're not unrelated at all. They're just not exactly the same thing. Um, so that's what I would say on that front.
Indeed.